Haplogroup J equals Japheth, Part 5. But before we get too deep into the video, first I want to tell you guys about my social media platforms. So I have a Clubhouse account, and we can actually talk to one another on it. I also host Clubhouse rooms every now and then where I might talk about history and genetics of the Middle East and Africa. I have a Twitter page, a Facebook account, and a Facebook page, as well as a Instagram, all titled The Hebrew of Israel. And what I typically do on these platforms is post upcoming videos as well as slides for my presentations. And so just be on the lookout for all of that on my social media platforms. And if you want to support me financially for the channel, you can look at my Patreon as well as my PayPal and my GoFundMe. And with all of that out of the way, let's begin with the video. The Hurrians, in connection to the Mitanni, the Hittites, the Amorites, and the Kassites. We learned a lot about the Hurrians, but there's more aspects to their history that we can dive deeper into. One interesting fact that I find extremely fascinating about the Hurrians was that these people were everywhere but nowhere at the same time. They truly shaped the ancient Near East, yet most people have never heard about them. I actually want you guys to tell me if you heard about the Hurrians in Bible class or a history class or wherever, because I surely didn't know about them. And when learning about these people, I'm like, wow, this is an entire civilization and ethnic group that's had probably the most influence out of really anyone in the ancient Near East. So comment down below if you've ever heard about the Hurrians prior to these videos. But anyways, a second fascinating fact about the Hurrians is that they often adopted and assimilated into Semitic and European cultures of the Middle East. And basically, these mysterious people were without a homeland, scattered across the Bronze and Iron Age of the Near East, adopting and assimilating into Semitic culture. That's one of the best ways to kind of summarize them to a certain extent. So the Hurrians were a people of the Bronze Age Near East. They spoke a Hurro-Uratrian language called Hurrian and lived in Anatolia, Syria, and northern Mesopotamia. The largest and most influential Hurrian nation was the Kingdom of Mitanni, its ruling class perhaps being Indo-Iranian speakers. The population of the Indo-European speaking Hittite Empire in Anatolia included a large portion of Hurrians, and there is significant Hurrian influence in Hittite mythology. So there, as you can see right there, that alone, dealing with Indo-Iranians being their rulers and being among the Hittites, who are another Indo-European people, it's very interesting. By the early Iron Age, the Hurrians had been assimilated with other peoples, and that's the main thing I want you to get out of this, is that around the time of the early Iron Age, the Hurrians were assimilating into the people that they were around. So this would be Semites and Indo-Europeans of the ancient Near East. Their remnants were subdued by a related people that formed the state of Urartu. So this is from Britannia, and it reads, the Hurrian and Mitanni kingdoms, the weakening of the Semitic states in Mesopotamia after 1550 enabled the Hurrians to penetrate deeper into this region, where they founded numerous small states in the eastern parts of Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and Syria. And so that's, again, showing you and displaying that when the Semitic states fell, this is sort of when the Hurrians began to rise, is when the Semites fell. I find that to be extremely interesting, because I didn't know Semitic civilizations failed the way they did, and that other people sort of, almost in a sense, took their place on the world scene and began to make small city-states. And this is World History Encyclopedia dealing with the Hurrians as well, and it reads, It was likely that the Hurrian conquest of that region was a complex phenomenon, including peaceful migration, infiltration by mercenary bands in the pay of local city-states, followed by the rise to power of mercenary warlords, culminating in the eventual full-scale migration of Hurrian herding tribes out of the mountains into the more fertile river valleys. And so that's very interesting. It's basically detailing that it wasn't just one type of way; it was multiple type of ways for them to come into these warmer lands towards the south in the Middle East. Peaceful migrations and basically warfare. And in continuing, it reads further: the Hurrians often seem to have adopted the culture of the city states they conquered, making them less visible than ever in historical record. And I find that to be very, very important to know about the Hurrians because uh, if they adopted into Semitic culture, then when you think about it, if these Hurrians had descendants, some people who are Semitic speakers today could descend from these Hurrians because they would descend from just their ancient ancestors that adopted into Semitic culture. Because, of course, the Hurrians, I highly doubt that they completely disappeared from the Middle East. They likely would have had descendants like any other ethnic group. Now, continuing, it reads, for example, we have no evidence of a distinctive Hurrian military system. It seems that if ever there were a people who were both everywhere and nowhere, it was the Hurrians. And that right there is why I think that they're the most fascinating people of the ancient Near East. And I just can't get over the fact how I never knew about these people. And but that right there explains why. This is from the Cambridge Ancient History, Part 1, the Middle East and the Aegean region, and it reads, the Hurrians, it is true, showed a marked capacity for assimilating the cultural values of the more advanced peoples with whom they came into contact. And so that's one thing you're going to read about the Hurrians over and over again. Over and over again. Most scholars are going to say this, that the Hurrians often adopted and assimilated into the cultures that they were around. This is one thing the Hurrians were quite known for. So let's learn about some of these ancient Near Eastern civilizations that the Hurrians were a part of. So let's first begin with the kingdom of Mitanni. So, kingdom of the Mitanni. Mitanni was a Hurrian-speaking state in northern Syria and southeast Anatolia. While the Mitanni kings and other members of royalty bore names of Indo-Aryan origin and invoked Indo-Aryan deities attested in the Rig Veda, they probably used the language of the local people, which was at that time a non-Indo-European language, Hurrian. Their sphere of influence is shown in Hurrian place names, personal names, and the spread through Syria and the Levant of a distinct pottery type. And so also I want to detail how these Hurrians were in Mitanni, and Mitanni was in Syria, and basically you have a non-Semitic people in ancient Syria. And when I was always growing up and reading history, I always assumed Syria was always Semitic speaking, but that's not the case. There actually were non-Semitic people in ancient Syria. And I find that to be intriguing. So the Mitanni controlled trade routes down the Khabur to Mari and up the Euphrates, from there to Karshemish. For a time, they also controlled the Assyrian territories of the upper Tigris and its head waters at Nineveh, Erbil, Ashur, and Nuzi. The whole area supported agriculture without artificial irrigation, and cattle, sheep, and goats were raised. It is very similar to Assyria in climate and was settled by both indigenous Hurrian and Amorite or Amoraic speaking Amru populations. The names of the Mitanni aristocracy frequently are of Indo-Aryan origin, and their deities also show Indo-Aryan roots: Mitra, Varuna, Indra, Nasatera. These Indo-Aryan deities are listed in two treaties between Mitanni and Hatti from Hattusa. The British Museum considers these documents as being from a date around 1350 BC. The common people's language, the Hurrian language, was neither Indo-European nor Semitic. Hurrian is related to Eritrean, the language of Urartu, both belonging to the Hurro-Eritrean language family. Bearers of names in the Hurrian language are attested in widespread areas of Syria and the northern Levant that are clearly outside the area of the political entity known to Assyria as Hanil-Galbat. In the 14th century BC, numerous city-states in northern Syria and Canaan were ruled by persons with Hurrian and some Indo-Aryan names. That's very interesting. It is believed that the warring Hurrian tribes and city-states became united under one dynasty after the collapse of Babylon due to the Hittite sack by Mursili I and the Kassite invasion. The Hittite conquest of Abalo Yamkada, the weak Middle Assyrian kings, and the internal strifes of the Hittites had created a power vacuum in Upper Mesopotamia. This led to the formation of the Kingdom of Mitanni. So basically, when a lot of these empires began to fall, Mitanni began to rise. Within a few centuries of the fall of Ukuna to Assyria, Mitanni became fully Assyrianized and linguistically Aramaicized, and the use of the Hurrian language began to be discouraged throughout the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And that right there is extremely key to note, because when you Assyrianize and Aramaicize these Hurrians, basically you're taking away the Hurrian tongue, and these Hurrians are going to grow up and live like these Semitic inhabitants, such as Assyrians and Aramaic peoples, and that partly kind of goes into the idea of these Hurrians assimilating, adopting into different cultures. Right here, they're assimilating and adopting into Assyrian and Aramaic culture, even though these people are originally a Northeast Caucasian people. And that's interesting because, to a certain extent, one could argue that some Syrians, not all, but some Assyrians, could even descend from Hurrians, and wouldn't know it because thousands and like 3,000 years ago, their Hurrian ancestor would have adopted and assimilated into Assyrian and Aramaic culture. So I think that's something key to kind of keep in mind, and that's also fairly interesting. So here is a map just detailing Mitanni, which was extremely large. And the population was, as they said, it was mostly Hurrian. You have Hurrians right here coming from the Northeast Caucasus to form the Mitanni Empire. And Mitanni was situated in modern-day Syria, in the upper Mesopotamia, northern Mesopotamia. And it was really, really large. So this is from World History Encyclopedia. The Hurrians, aka Hurri or Hurri, were a Bronze Age people who flourished across the Near East from the 4th millennium BCE to the 1st millennium BCE. Hurrians formed the principal cultural elements of the Bronze Age Mitanni kingdom and blended with the culture of the neighboring and then conquering Hittites. By the late Bronze Age, the Hurrians had been assimilated into surrounding cultures in the Near East, but many of their gods and myths could many of their gods and myths would live on in later cultures. When the kingdom of Akkad fell in 2190 BCE, the Hurrians and others exploited consequent power vacuum in Mesopotamia. And that's also another key thing to remember because Akkad was a powerful Semitic empire in Mesopotamia. And after it fell, Hurrians began to just migrate deeper into the Middle East, going into Mesopotamia, and of course going beyond Mesopotamia because they managed to reach uh, Syria and Canaan. And it reads, there was no Hurrian empire as such, but some of the independent city-states ruled by Hurrian kings may well have formed together in a loose confederation. By the second quarter of the second millennium BCE, the Hurrians were migrating into northern Syria and eastern Anatolia as they moved westward and southward. Once again, military conquest was mixed with the peaceful migration of Hurrian merchants, farmers, artisans, and nomads. And that's again important to just note. In some cases, it is an invasion, but in other cases, it is peaceful. These are just ancient people trying to find new land, trying to find a new place to set up shop or better fertile areas. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Now, continuing, it says the Hanagalbat, an area of Upper Mesopotamia, became the heartland of the Mitanni kingdom, which is from 1500 through 1240 BCE, which was predominantly Hurrian in culture. So again, just showing you another map of the ancient Mitanni kingdom. And here is Wash Ukana, and forgive me for any mispronunciations. And it basically extended, the Mitanni kingdom basically extended from Syria all the way into Iraq, modern day Syria and modern day Iraq, and even into modern day Anatolia. And the population, as they said, was mostly Hurrian. So you mostly had a northeast Caucasian people in the center of the ancient Middle East, a non-Semitic population heavily concentrated in the center part of the Middle East, which today is mostly Semitic speaking. So that's very interesting to note. So continuing, it reads, the Assyrians knew the kingdom as Hani Galbat, also given as Hani Galbat or Hani Rabat, and the Hittites referred to the peoples as the Hurri, and their territory as the land of the Hurri, and the land of the Hurrians. And so most modern day scholars agree that they were Hurrians. They used the language of the local people, which was at the time a non-Indo-Iranian language, Hurrian. Scholar Gwyndolin Leek writes, the population of Mitanni was predominantly Hurrian, but the ruling class were Indo-European warriors who called themselves Mariuni and were worshipped and who worshipped deities with Vedic names such as Indra, Umrana, and the collective devas. This elite was to intermarry with the local people as the names of their children testify. And that's also very interesting how you have Indo-Europeans in the ancient Middle East and ancient Syria, and that they ruled over these populations, and they were specifically Indo-Iranian, and they were, tasked with intermarrying the local people. So, in another sense, when it comes to modern day, some of these modern day Middle Eastern populations, some of them could even descend from Indo-Iranians, which is interesting. Could basically descend from Indo-Europeans. By the way, this again is from World History Encyclopedia Mitanni, specifically. I want to note that. To the east, the Mitanni had good relations with the Hurrian-speaking Kassites, whose territory corresponds to present-day Kurdistan. And again, here is the Mitanni Kingdom, very, very large, in the center of the Middle East, ancient Middle East. Here are your Hurrians, being the bulk of the population. And here are the Kassites that they mentioned, but we'll get into them later. The Hurrian and Mitanni kingdoms. So again, just reiterating, the weakening of the Semitic states in Mesopotamia after 1550 enabled the Hurrians to penetrate deeper into these lands, where they founded numerous small states in the eastern parts of Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and Syria. Again, here's just another map of the Mitanni Empire. Just look at how wide it is, going from Syria to modern-day Iraq. And this book, The Chechenians, also detail the connection between the Hurrians and Mitanni, and it reads, the Empire of Mitanni appeared in 1550 BC, probably to the southwest of the Armenian Plateau, and was made up at least partially by Hurrian subjects, although there is some indication that the ruling class was of Indo-European extraction. Hurrian was used as the language of state. Mitanni annexed Assyria in 1472 BC. The Mitanni culture, a unique blend of native Hurrian traditions and Sumerian and Akkadian cultural inputs, had in no small measure influenced the civilization of the Hittites and other peoples. The Mitannis perfected the two-wheeled war chariot, which had such a large impact on warfare from the 15th century BC. Mitanni was undone in 1300 BC, after having been subjected first to Hittite and then Assyrian attacks. So again, here is the Mitanni, here's the Hurrians, here's the Eraturians. This is showing you another map. So the Hurrians migrated south after the fall of the Akkadian Empire and other Semitic city-states in Mesopotamia. This is around the time the Mitanni Empire began to rise. The Mitanni Kingdom was predominantly ethnically Hurrian, but many of the ruling elite class and warriors were Indo-European Iranians or Aryans. But both groups mixed with each other and assimilated. The Mitanni Kingdom was extremely large. It encompassed northern Syria and southeast Anatolia, as well as modern-day Iraq. But the Mitanni Empire fell to the Hittites and the Assyrians. And remember, the Hurrians were Assyrian-sized and Americized. Basically, the Hurrians assimilated and adopted the Semitic culture and language of the Assyrians and Aramaic people. Even though the Hurrians and Iranian Mitanni people were not Semitic in origin, but Caucasian and Indo-European. This is very interesting because this means some Assyrians, again not all, but some Assyrians and Aramaic people could be of Hurrian and Iranian Mitanni ancestry and not Semitic in origin, but descendants of Assyrianized and Aramaic-sized Hurrians and Iranians of the Mitanni. As a matter of fact, DNA does actually confirm this. If you were to look at Assyrian DNA tests, it would come out as Iranian and Caucasian, which I found to be very shocking and interesting. So this is the study, the genomic history of the Middle East, and it actually details this. It says, present-day Levantines are drawn toward Bronze Age Europeans. But here's the kicker. Iraqi Arabs, Iraqi Kurds, and Assyrians appear relatively closer to ancient Iranians. And that's what I was referring to earlier. And of course, we know Iranians are not Semitic, they're Indo-European. So here is DNA tests from Assyrian people, just some Assyrians, and as you can see right here, if they were to take, let's say, a DNA test from 23andMe, it would show that they're West Asian and North African, 99.6%, but really it's specifically noting the West Asian. You see that the highest percentage, 73.0% of this person's DNA, is Iranian and Caucasian. And so I wanted to look at more DNA tests to see, okay, maybe there's more to this. But then I looked at another, and this person, 100% Western Asian descent, and it's Iranian and Caucasian. And by the way, if you want to find these DNA tests, just go to Reddit at 23andMe and type in Assyrian DNA test. And I actually want to go back to this real quick. It kind of details. It says from Armenians and Assyrians to, this is just another word for Caucasian, Caucasians and Persians, the diverse people of Iran and the Caucasus and eastern Anatolia and Mesopotamia, share a ancient genetic history dating back to some of the world's first farmers. And if you just continue reading that, but I find that to be very interesting how the DNA is kind of lumped together with really more so the non-Semitic types, like Armenians who know aren't Semitic, Caucasians who aren't Semitic, and Persians who aren't Semitic. Those are all Indo-European peoples. We've gone over in the past about the Armenians, Caucasians, and Persian Iranians. So it's a bit interesting how that's the case. You look at other various DNA tests of Assyrians, and you typically see, obviously, they are a West Asian people. I would not deny that. But you do see them genetically related to Iranian and Caucasians, basically non-Semitic peoples in ancient times and even today. But I'm not discounting that they're Middle Eastern. Assyrians are definitely Middle Eastern. And I'm not saying every Assyrian has this type of genetic makeup. There's probably some with a different genetic makeup. But I did find some Assyrians that do in fact have an Iranian and Caucasian ancestry. But this doesn't have to be every single Assyrian, of course. And just here again, this is an Assyrian. The DNA is Iranian and Caucasian. Iranian and Caucasian. Of course, I'm not saying every single Assyrian or Aramaic person in the Near East has this particular genetic makeup, but I am just showing that those with that Iranian Caucasian DNA, that could be indications of being descendants of the Hurrians and the Mitanni people who were a Caucasian and Iranian people. And I would still say that these people are Middle Eastern because they are, and I would still say that they are Assyrian and that they are Aramaic because that's their culture for thousands of years. Even if they were to descend from these populations that were assimilated into their culture, I would still go ahead and say, yeah, they're Assyrian, that they're Aramaic, because for thousands of years they've just been practicing and speaking that culture and language. And we know that Assyrians today are very diverse. If you look at their haplogroups, various haplogroups, E, J, R, etc. So just showing this, it is showing the beauty and the diversity of the ancient Near East, in that some of these Near Eastern populations would descend from populations such as Hurrians and Mitanni Iranians. So I just find that to be very interesting. And this does make sense when you look at the proximity of Assyria to the Mitanni Empire and the Hurrians. Ancient Assyria was surrounded by the Hurrians and the Mitanni Kingdom. Therefore, mixing would have been highly inevitable. Again, here in yellow is the Assyrian Empire, and here in brown is Hurrians. So Hurrians and Assyrians would have been overlapped with one another back in ancient times. So it will make a lot of sense. Also, here in green is Mitanni. So it would make a lot of sense that there would have been mixing in ancient times and assimilation, and etc. So this leads me to the next ancient people the Hurrians were part of, and this is the Hittites. So let's dig into the Hittites, the Hittite people. It is generally assumed that the Hittites came into Anatolia sometime before 2000 BC. The arrival of the Hittites in Anatolia in the Bronze Age was one of a superstate imposing itself on a native culture, in this case over the pre-existing Hatthians and Hurrians, either by means of conquest or gradual assimilation. So when the Hittites, by the way, when the Hittites came into Anatolia, they sort of planted their nation on top of another people. And the Hattians were like one of the original nations. And there was also Hurrians there because, of course, we know about the Hurrians existing in Armenia and Anatolia and around. So just like Assyria, it was kind of inevitable for the Hurrians and the Hittites to not assimilate into one another. So continuing, it says, in archaeological terms, relationships of the Hittites to the Azero culture of the Balkans and Mayakope culture of the Caucasus have been considered within the migration framework. The Indo-European element at least establishes Hittite culture as intrusive to Anatolia in the scholarly mainstream. The dominant indigenous inhabitants in central Anatolia at the time were Hurrians and Hattians, who spoke non-Indo-European languages, but some have argued that Hattic was a Northwest Caucasian language. So basically, Caucasian peoples were in Anatolia. But its affiliation remains uncertain, whilst the Hurrian language was a near isolate, i.e., it was one of only 2 or 3 language families in the Hurrian family. One innovation that can be credited to these early Hittite rulers is the practice of conducting treaties and alliances with neighboring states. The Hittites were thus among the earliest known pioneers in the art of international politics and diplomacy. This is also when the Hittite religion adopted several gods and rituals from the Hurrians. And that's one thing you're going to learn about the Hittites on your own time if you were to dig into the Hittite history. They were really known as like the city of 1,000 gods because the Hittites were very loose and okay with other people practicing their religions. And they, of course, adopted the Hurrian religions, but they also allowed other religions as well, which I find to be very interesting. And it almost reminds me of Hellenistic Greece. And that's one thing you kind of see with a lot of these ancient Indo-European cultures is allowing people to practice what they want. The Hittites, as an example that we just read, but the Greeks and even the Persians, and again, Persians, Iranians, they're Indo-European people. So I find that to be kind of interesting about ancient Europeans of the Mediterranean and the Balkans. Rome also allowed religious freedom. Anyways, Hittite mythology was also influenced more directly by the Hurrians, a neighboring civilization close to Anatolia, where the Hittites were located. Hurrian mythology was so closely related that Oxford University Press published a guide to mythology and characterized Hittite and Hurrian mythology together as Hittite Hurrian. So Hittites and Hurrians were very intertwined with one another. Hittite mythology is a mix of Hattian, Hurrian, and Hittite influences, Mesopotamian, and Canaanite influences enter the mythology of Anatolia through Hurrian mythology. Very interesting. So here is ancient Hatti, Hittite Anatolia, and it is also widespread, just like the Mitanni Empire. Hatti pretty much took over a large swath of Anatolia, modern day Turkey. It's very fascinating how large it actually was when you think about it. So this is from World History Encyclopedia, the Hittites, and it reads, the Hittites occupied the ancient region of Anatolia, also known as Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, prior to 1700 BCE, developed a culture apparently from the indigenous Hatti and possibly the Hurrian people. The expansion expanded their territories into an empire which rivaled and threatened the established nation of Egypt. And the Hittites were definitely an adversary of the Egyptians. Check out the Battle of Kadesh as an example. It was kind of a mutual win for both sides. No one really won that battle, even though they both kind of claimed they won it. But yeah, the Hittites and the Egyptians definitely had some beef. But they also traded daughters from one another, which I find to be interesting. And also is just sort of another example in way how Indo-European populations entered into Egypt. But we'll touch on that way in the future. Anyways, the Hittite control of the region is divided by modern-day scholars into two periods: the Old Kingdom, 1700 through 1500 BCE, and the New Kingdom, also known as the Hittite Empire, 1400 through 1200 BCE. So again, here's just another map detailing the Hittite Empire, and it is extremely large, taking up all of modern-day Turkey and parts of the Caucasus. I would say this would be Armenia and some other countries, and even in parts of Syria. And again, these Hittites are an Indo-European people. These are an Anatolian Indo-European people in the ancient Middle East. And basically, one of the things I want people to understand is that the ancient Middle East was not just Semitic people. And that's what I always sort of thought of when reading Bible stories and thinking of and being in history class, that the Middle East was just simply Semitic only. And there was really nobody else there, but that is not the case. You had Indo-Europeans in the Middle East. You had non-Semitic populations in the Middle East. It's way more complex than just Semitic Middle Easterners in the Middle East, Indo-European peoples in Europe, and Hamitic peoples in Africa. No, it's way more complex than that. So continuing, this is from World History Encyclopedia dealing with the Hurrians, and it reads, from the 16th through 15th century BCE, there was increasing antagonism between the Hittite Empire 1700 through 1200 BCE and Mitanni. This was a continuation of the hostilities between Hittites and Hurrians, which had been ongoing in the 17th century BCE, Syria being a particular bone of contention. Although a coincidence of Hittite expansion was that as more Hurrians came under Hittite rule, there was a further spreading of Hurrian cultural elements westwards, especially deities, which were borrowed and loaned between the two cultures and others in the region. For example, the Hurrian storm god Tusheb became identified with the Anatolian god of the same function, Tar-Hunza. Once more, the Hurrian culture was being assimilated by both friend and foe across the region. And that's just sort of funny to me about the Hurrians, that they were kind of good at getting both allies and enemies, and both allies and enemies sort of took upon their traits. And that's just something I don't really read about in history. And that's just a little funny, actually. So, continuing, it says, following the conquest and division of Mitanni by Assyria and Hatti in the mid-13th century BCE, the Hurrian language and culture continued under the political control of the Hittites and Assyrians. In the first millennium BCE, the Hurrians had been absorbed into other cultures of the region, but, as previously, elements of their culture became intermixed with that of their successors. So yeah, that's another thing about these Hurrians. They kind of got conquered a lot, I would say, by more powerful people, and because of this, they basically kind of got absorbed and intermixed with those people. So they're kind of like a lost, wandering people without a homeland, because they kept getting conquered, and then they will intermix with the surrounding more powerful nations like Assyria and the Hittites. It's kind of why they're everywhere. So here's just another map of the Hittite kingdom. And as we just read, we have the Mitanni with a lot of Hurrians over here. Then you have the Hittites with a lot of Hurrians over here. So you actually, when you think about it, you have a lot of these Caucasian, these non-Semitic people in the Middle East, stretching from, now adding the Hittites, stretching from Anatolia to Syria to Iraq. And we know everybody north of here is Caucasian. Well, mostly Caucasian. So that's a very wide range we're dealing with. So the Hurrians were in Anatolia before the Hittites arrived. The Hittites attacked the Mitanni Empire, much, like the Assyrians. And like the Assyrians, the Hurrians assimilated into Hittite culture. And Hittites also adopted Hurrian gods, rituals, and religion. Furthermore, they became intermixed with each other between the Hurrians and the Hittites. But it doesn't end here. The Hurrians also joined themselves with another Semitic people, such as the Amorites in the kingdom of Yemhad. So let's deal with Yemhad. And that's how I pronounce it. Forgive me for my mispronunciation if that's not how it's pronounced. So the Amorites were an ancient northwest Semitic-speaking people from the Levant who also occupied large parts of southern Mesopotamia from the 21st century BCE to the end of the 17th century BCE, where they established several prominent cities in existing locations, as in Islan, Larsa, and later notably Babylon, which was raised from a single town to an independent state in a major city. During the 15th through 14th centuries BC, the Amorite city of Qatna received deep influence from the Hurrian language, as scribes of the city incorporated Hurrian elements into their text. I would say that's actually a pretty big achievement of the Hurrians to even get the scribes of the Amorites to sort of influence some of their elements into their text. That's a really big achievement. But anyways, it says, after the fall of the Akkadian Empire, Hurrians began to settle in the cities and its surrounding, or in the city and its surrounding. By circa 1725 BC, they constituted a sizable portion of the population. The presence of a large Hurrian population brought Hurrian culture and religion to Helebeb, as evidenced by the existence of certain religious festivals that bear Hurrian names. So really, Hurrians sort of started overpopulating the Amorites and really infused with the Amorites when you really think about it, because their culture began to really become on top of the Amorite culture. The Hurrians also migrated further west in this period. By 1725 BC, they are found also in parts of northern Syria, such as Al-Lahi. The mixed Amorite Hurrian kingdom of Yemhad is recorded as struggling for this area with the early Hittite king Hattusili I around 1600 BC. The Hurrians also settled in the coastal region of Admedya in the country of Kizuwata, southern Anatolia. Yemhad eventually weakened the powerful Hittites, but this also opened Anatolia for Hurrian cultural influences. The Hittites were influenced by both the Hurrian and Hattian cultures over the course of several centuries. Yemhad was an ancient Semitic kingdom centered on Heleb, or Eblo Syria. The kingdom emerged at the end of the 19th century BC and was ruled by the Yemhadic dynasty kings, who counted on both military and diplomacy to expand their realm. From the beginning of its establishment, the kingdom withstood the aggressions of its neighbors, Mari, Quatsna, and Syria, and was turned into the most powerful Syrian kingdom of its era through the actions of its king Yermin Lim I. Excuse me for my mispronunciations. Yamhad's population was predominantly Amorite and had a typical Bronze Age Syrian culture. Yamhad was also inhabited by a subsequent Hurrian population that settled in the kingdom, adding the influence of their culture. The people of Yamhad practiced the Amorite religion and mainly worshipped the northwest Semitic deities. The most important of this were Dagon, who was considered the father of the gods, and Hadad, who was the most important deity and the head of the pantheon. The kingdom was known as the land of Hadad, who was famous as the storm god of Heleb, beginning in the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. As the Hurrian presence grew, so did Hurrian religious influences, and some of the Hurrian deities found a place in the Yamhadite pantheon. King Abba el I mentioned receiving the support of the Hurrian goddess Heb or Hebat in one of the Alaalek tablets. Hebat was the spouse of the Hurrian main deity Tusheb, but in Abba el I's tablet, she is associated with Hadad. Later, the Hurrians started to identify Tusheb with Hadad, who became Tusheb, the storm god of Heleb. So basically, there was a lot of influencing and infusion of Hurrian and Amorite religion. So much so, it even went up to the pantheons with the mixing and saying that this god married that god and so on. So here is Yamhad, where you had the Hurrians and the Amorites. This is their kingdom. Infusion of Amorite and Hurrian, both religiously and perhaps even genetically. So this book deals with the ancient Near East, and it details a section dealing with the Hurrians and Yamhad and the Amorites. This book is called Between Myth and Mandate, and it reads, "The origins of the Hurrians remain murky. Related to the Eritrean, these people are thought to have wandered from the foothills of the Caucasus, settling by circa 2500 BCE between the Zagros foothills and the Kebir River Valley, establishing a kingdom centered on the city of Ukadish. By 1725 BCE, they had migrated west and established the Amorite Hurrian kingdom of Yamhad, which directly challenged the Hittite kingdom under Hattusili I in 1650 through 1620 BCE. So again, just another map of Yamhad, so you can kind of get a good idea of where this Amorite Hurrian mixed kingdom is situated. And this book is called Mythologies, a polytheistic view of the world. And it reads, the Hurrians also migrated west in this period. By 1725 BCE, they are found also in parts of northern Syria, such as Alaalek. The Amoritic Hurrian kingdom of Yamhad is recorded as struggling for this area with the early Hittite king Hattusili I around 1600 BCE. Hurrians also settled on the coastal region of Adamanyah in the country of Kuzuwatina. Yamhad eventually weakened to the powerful Hittites, But this also opened Anatolia for Hurrian cultural influences. The Hittites were influenced by the Hurrian culture over the course of several centuries. Again, here's Yamhad, and here's the Hurrians right up here, and the Hittites over here. Here is Kazuwatana. So here's just a good map detailing everything. So the kingdom of Yamhad was a mixture of Semitic Amorites and Hurrians. It would seem to have been formed after the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. This is when Hurrians were spreading across the ancient Near East. Remember, this mixed kingdom of Amorites and Hurrians was assimilation and adoption of religion and likely intermixing. And this is no different than any other nation that we've mentioned thus far. This leads to the next and final nation we'll cover, because there actually are a lot of other nations that the Hurrians influenced, and we'll cover more of them later. But for now, we're only going to deal with one more, and it's the Kassites of Babylon. So let's look into the history of Babylon and the Kassites. So the Kassites were people of the ancient Near East who controlled Babylonia after the fall of the Old Babylonian Empire, 1595 BC, and until 1155 BC. They gained control of Babylonia after the Hittite sack of the city in 1595 BC, i.e. 1531 BC per the short chronology, and established a dynasty based first in Babylon and later in Dur-Kurgalzu. The Kassites were members of a small military autocracy, but were efficient rulers and locally popular. And their 500 500-year reign led an essential groundwork for the development of subsequent Babylonian culture. And that's one thing I want y'all to keep in mind once we learn about the identity of these Kassites, that they ruled Babylon for 500 years. That is an extremely long time. And that they laid the groundwork for Babylonian culture. So keep that in mind once we realize who the Kassites are. Anyways, further it says, the chariot and the horse which the Kassites worshipped first came into use in Babylonia at this time. The Kassite language has not been classified. What is known is that their language was not related to either the Indo-European language group nor the Semitic or other Afro-Asiatic languages. So their language isn't Semitic, and it isn't Indo-European, and it's not even Afro-Asiatic. So, and these people ruled Babylon for 500 years. But anyways, and is most likely to have been a language isolate. Although some linguists have proposed a link to the Hurru-Uratrian languages of Asia Minor. According to some data, the Kassites were a Hurrian tribe. And that right there is extremely intriguing. Now continuing, it says, however, the arrival of the Kassites have been connected to the contemporary migrations of Indo-European peoples. Several Kassite leaders and deities bore Indo-European names, and it is possible that they were dominated by an Indo-European elite, similar to the Mitanni, who ruled over the Hurru-Uratrian speaking Hurrians of Asia Minor. And one thing that I'm starting to see about the Hurrians is that for some reason, they typically migrated with a lot of Indo-European peoples. They sort of, both Indo-Europeans and Hurrians travel together, it would seem like, or that they at least got along with each other. And typically, these Indo-European groups that the the Hurrians were with were an Iranian type of people. And that's fairly interesting when it comes to these Kassites, because Kassites, a mixture of possibly Hurrian and Indo-European people, ruled Babylon for 500 years, and I'm pretty sure most of us would assume Babylon was always forever Semitic, and that is simply not the case. So here is the Kassite Empire. It's showing you a map of the Kassites. Got Hurrians coming in and ruling or becoming a bulk of the population. So this is an excerpt from the book, The Peoples of the Highland Vanished Cultures of Lurstan, Manani, and Urartu. And it reads, two other peoples are directly relevant, namely the Kassites from the Zagros Mountains in the range of Lurstan, and the Hurrians who spread from regions further north, particularly from Armenia. Both were themselves native peoples of the highland and spoke languages which were not Indo-European, but belonged to a group sometimes loosely called Caucasian, once widespread but later surviving only in the Caucasus. They were led by Indo-European aristocracies, small in number but great in energy and achievement. They were the first to use the horse in war, to draw the light chariot with spoked wheels. Indo-European names of gods at least appear among the Kassites, and of gods and rulers much more obviously among the Hurrians, in whom this element was clearly stronger. In both cases, the names reveal the Indic branch of the Indo-European family, of which the main body moved through Iran to conquer northern India. And that right there is detailing what I said earlier about the Kassites being Indo-European, but specifically Iranian, or what some people might say Aryan. And here's just a map of the Kassite Empire. Here's Middle Babylonian Kingdom, which was ruled by the Kassites during that time. Just detailing where they're at. And really, when we think about it, putting everything together with the Hurrians among the Hittites and the Mitanni and the Kassites, this is all basically Hurrian territory when you think about it. This is all high population of Hurrian and also Iranian peoples. So it's fairly interesting. Except maybe with the Hittites. They were an Anatolian Indo-European people. So this book is called Who Were the Greeks? And it reads, about 2000 BC. Babylonian documents began to record a long, gradual expansion of alien tribes from beyond the Tigris, originating in or beyond the mountains, and about 1760, Babylonia itself became subject to the Kassite dynasty, whose official language is neither Semitic nor Sumerian, nor indeed of any recognizable affinity. But the Kassites introduced the horse into Babylonia and used it, like the Aryans who were bringing it at about the same time into northern India, not for riding but for drawing wheeled vehicles. It is inferred that they had been in contact before arrival in Babylonia with people of Aryan culture and speech. More than this, among the names of Kassite kings are some which appear to contain Indo-European elements, as though they belonged to families which had once used Indo-European speech but had lost it as their official language. Through assimilation to the people of Kassite speech, whose movements they were now directing, some Kassite deities seem to have Indo-European names. So again, here is Kassite Babylonia, and it basically went all the way from southern Iraq, southern Mesopotamia, and it would have stopped at the Mitanni Empire, which is another population of people with Hurrians, and then up to the Hattians, it was another population of Hurrians, and then to the north of them are basically where the Hurrians came from. So a lot of Hurrian territory that we're dealing with. A lot of Caucasian people that we're dealing with. So this is World History Encyclopedia Britannia. This is World History Encyclopedia dealing with the Mitanni, and it reads: to the east, the Mitanni had good relations with the Hurrian-speaking Kassites whose territory corresponds to present-day Kurdistan. And I want to read that to remind you all that, there are those who do basically say that Kassites were Hurrians, were a Hurrian tribe. And here is Kassite Babylonia. Here's a closer map. Kassite Babylonia going all the way up to the Mitanni, going all the way up to the Hittites. Again, all of this is basically Hurrian peoples, a lot of Hurrian peoples, and you would have had Iranian peoples as the ruling class for some reason. But so the Kassites ruled Babylon for 500 years. Just keep that in mind. They ruled Babylon in modern-day Iraq for 500 years. And they had been a mixture, they likely were a mixture of Hurrian and Iranian or Aryan peoples, or at least the ruling class was, Iranian. But a Hurrian and Iranian class of people conquered and ruled Babylonia, modern-day Iraq, for 500 years and had a great influence upon Babylonian culture. I find this to be extremely interesting. Essentially, an Indo-European Iranian people and the Northeast Caucasian people ruled Babylon longer than any other ancient Semitic civilization. And this is something that, again, I keep reiterating this, but this is something that I just never knew in history growing up. That, Babylon wasn't just Semitic, it was also Indo-European and also Caucasian, and that these people kind of ruled parts of the Middle East longer than even the Semites did, which is a bit perplexed when you think about it. So furthermore, the fact that a non-Semitic people ruling over Babylon is equally fascinating, whether they were Iranian or Hurrian, because again, they're not. Some people aren't 100% sure about who the Kassites are. Like some again are saying that they're Iranians or they're Hurrians. Either way, whichever ethnic group they are, they're likely both. Just like the Mitanni, you basically have a non-Semitic people that lived and flourished in ancient Babylonia, which most people would assume was always Semitic. And like I always say, what happened to the Kassites? What happened to these Hurrians and these Iranian peoples? Obviously, they didn't just disappear. Likely, their descendants would still be there today. But, however, again, genetically speaking, this does make sense. Many modern-day Iraqis are basically descendants of ancient Iranians and Caucasians. This is from the Genomic History of the Middle East, and it reads, present-day Levantines are drawn towards Bronze Age Europeans, but here's the main thing. Iraqi Arabs, Iraqi Kurds, and Assyrians appear relatively closer to ancient Iranians. Remember, Iranians are Indo-Europeans. So here are DNA tests of Iraqi people. I'm using both Iraqi people and Iraqi Kurdish. You can get this from Reddit on 23andMe, and it shows most of their DNA being West Asian, which I do not disagree with. These are West Asian peoples, but what is their specific ancestry? It shows that they are Iranian and Caucasian. Iranian and Caucasian. 99.3% West Asian. Genetically, they're basically Iranian and Caucasian, 93.7%. You look at multiple DNA tests of Iraqi peoples, it's going to show Iranian and Caucasian, Iranian and Caucasian, Iranian and Caucasian. And who are the peoples that ruled in the ancient Near East? It was, the rulers were typically Iranian or Aryan, and then the general population was typically Hurrian. And these peoples did intermix. The local population, the Hurrians, as we read earlier, that was something that the ruling class wanted to do. So that's what we see in the DNA. And this is actually very important to know, because this is exactly why African Americans would never, ever test 100% when it comes to Middle Eastern ancestry, because Middle Eastern DNA is basically Caucasian and Iranian. And obviously, African Americans are not a Caucasian and Iranian people. Many modern day Middle Easterners are descendants of Caucasian and Iranian populations. And so that is something to sort of keep in mind when it comes to these DNA tests, and just, the fact of the matter when we test these ancient populations. Now, with that being said, I wouldn't say that Caucasian and Iranian components are the original Semitic type. I wouldn't say that, but I would agree that it is Middle Eastern. But original Semitic, no, those are non-Semitic populations. But anyways, so the Hurrians were a widespread people among the Mitanni, which was Iranians of Syria, the Hittites who were Anatolian Europeans, the Amorites who were Semites in Syria, the Assyrians who were Semites in northern Iraq, and the Kassites who were Iranians of Iraq. The Hurrians were a very important people to study and learn about when it comes to the ancient Near East, and that they were with all these ancient, powerful Middle Eastern kingdoms. But yet, they are the less and least known by most laymen when it comes to history. And again, I want y'all to comment down below if you knew about the Hurrians prior to these videos, and if you knew about the Hurrian influences with these powerful kingdoms like the Mitanni, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Syrians, and the Kassites. But also comment down below if you knew about the Hittites being Europeans, and if you knew about these civilizations like the Mitanni and the Kassites possibly being Iranians in origin. Like, did you know about these many Indo-European civilizations, these non-Semitic civilizations in the ancient Middle East? I'd kind of like to know how many people knew about this, because this is extremely fascinating to me, because I assumed everybody was Semitic in the ancient Middle East, and most people kind of assumed that the Middle East was just always Semitic. It was never anything else, but that's just entirely false. There was many ancient populations there, and the ancient Middle East was very complex. And another interesting fact about the Hurrians is that they often assimilated and adopted into the culture of their rulers, and the rulers adopted some of the culture of the Hurrians as well. But ultimately, the Hurrians would blend with society, which is fascinating. That's why we don't know about them as well, because they kind of just disappeared. And a lot of the people that the Hurrians kind of assimilated with were Semites, but also with Iranian groups. Again, this is from World History Encyclopedia, and it reads, "It was likely that the Hurrian conquest of the region was a complex phenomenon, including peaceful migration, infiltration by mercenary bands, and the pay of local city-state, followed by the rise to power of mercenary warlords, culminating in the eventual full-scale migration of Hurrian herding tribes out of the mountains into the more fertile river valleys. Further, the Hurrians often seem to have adopted the culture of the city-states they conquered, making them less visible than ever in historical record. For example, we have no evidence of a distinctive Hurrian military system. It seems that if ever there were a people who were both everywhere and nowhere, it was the Hurrians." And again, it was for multiple ways that the Hurrians came into the Middle East. Some were peaceful, some were warlike. But at the end of the day, they adopted wherever they settled. They adopted the culture of the people wherever they settled. And this is from the Cambridge Ancient History, the Middle East, and the Aegean region. And it reads, "The Hurrians, it is true, showed a marked capacity for assimilating the cultural values of the more advanced peoples with whom they came into contact. The Hurrians must have been very widespread, because they were the population of the ancient Near Eastern kingdoms we find in Anatolia, Syria, Mesopotamia, Iraq, and Iran, and of course, southern Caucasus of Armenia. These people, as they said, were everywhere but nowhere at the same time in the Near East. But here is a massive question we must ask ourselves. Where did they go? What happened to the ancient Hurrians? Like, did they just disappear? And I think that's just something that we should kind of ponder on and think about just for a moment. Because remember, they kind of dominated the Middle East, or at least were widespread across the ancient Near East. So there's no way that they could have just vanished from the entire landmass of the Middle East. Their descendants would still have to be around today. However, with that being said, would it be difficult to find these people, the descendants of the Hurrians, since they assimilated and adopted the cultures of their neighbors? Well, it would, but that is where DNA comes into play. But this is where we'll end the Hurrians, the Mitanni, the Hittites, the Amorites, and the Kassites. The Hurrians and the Kurds. So we've talked extensively about the Hurrians, and we talked about the various groups that could descend from the Hurrians, such as Chechens, Ingish, Armenians, etc. Well, let's actually look at one more population, another population that could descend from the Hurrians in modern day. And let's turn our attention to the Kurds and their connection to the Hurrians. So this is from the book The Chechens, and it reads, "The Hurrians were so ubiquitous that many Indo-Iranian and Indo-European peoples are believed to have substantive Hurrian contributions in their ethnogenesis." And that's something that I mentioned in the past as well, that for some reason Hurrians often found themselves among the Indo-Iranians or Iranian peoples or Aryan peoples, and basically Indo-European peoples. They either like traveled a lot together for some reason, and they got along with each other, because you typically see them mixing, Iranians and Hurrians, or the Iranians being the ruling class of the Hurrians. But we see that with the Mitanni. We see that possibly with the Kassites in Babylonia. So Iranian and Hurrian peoples are kind of intertwined. One logical reason for this could be that you do just find a lot of Iranians, a lot of these branch of Indo-Europeans in the Middle East. So naturally, they would be around each other. So that's just a quick logical reason as to why that might be the reason. But anyways, continuing, it says, for example, the Kurds consider themselves and their culture as descendants of the Hurrians and their civilization, despite linguistic diversification. So I'm going to stop right there, because I want to show you all this map of the Hurrians in ancient Kurda, or Kuriti. Keep this location in mind, and as well as the Hurrians, their location. And here's Kurdistan, or the Kurdish inhabited area. It kind of overlaps with one another, with the ancient land of the Hurrians and the Mitanni. Here is the Hurrian, Urartu, and Mitanni. Here are basically Kurdistan, or the place where a lot of Kurdish people live. They perfectly overlap one another. So this paper will actually deal with the genetic ancestry and the genetic relations of peoples to the Kurds. It's a really good paper that y'all should check out. It's called HLA Alleles and Haplotypes in the Turkish Population, Relatedness to Kurds, Armenians, and other Mediterraneans. So it reads, Turkish and Kurdish HLA profiles are studied for the first time. The comparative study of their allele frequencies, characteristic haplotypes, genetic distances with other Mediterraneans is complemented by neighbor joining dendrograms and correspondence analysis. Turks, Kurds, Armenians, Iranians, Jews, Lebanese, and other Eastern and Western Mediterranean groups seem to share a common ancestry. the other Mediterranean substream. And so keep all those groups in mind as having a common ancestry. Anyways, it reads, Anatolian Hittite and Hurrian groups older than 2000 BC. These may, these may have given rise to present-day Kurdish, Armenian, and Turkish populations. So basically, Kurdish, Armenians, and Turkic peoples, well, excuse me, not Turkic, but Turkish peoples, could descend from Anatolian Hittites and Hurrians. And by the way, there is a difference between a Turkish person and a Turkic person. A Turkic person is someone from the Turkic tribes in Central Asia, but a Turkish person is someone who's a bit more native and local to Anatolia, which would be kind of like people who come from the Balkans and had settled that area. So just keep that in mind. So continuing, it says, Turks cluster within the Eastern Mediterraneans, including Kurds and Armenians. Taking all our different types of data analysis together, Turks, other Anatolians, like Kurds and Armenians and Iranians, appear as belonging to the older Mediterranean substratum included within the Eastern Mediterranean group. So Anatolians and Kurds and Armenians and Iranians, they're all sort of linked together, which kind of makes sense from what we've been looking at when it comes to a historical perspective of all these groups. And it reads, in summary, it seems that Turks, Kurds, and Armenians are very close genetically, and all of them seem to have been living in the area for many millennia. And that is true, with Armenians descending from Hurrians and Kurds seemingly descending from Hurrians, as well as Turkish people. And again, all these groups, keep in mind, they are non-Semitic populations, non-Semitic people from their genesis. So here is the Kurdish inhabited area. Again, just showing you a map of where the Kurds are. Here's Armenia up here. Here's Turkey. So, and here's Iran as well. So just keep all this territory in mind. And then here in brown is the Hurrians, stretching from Iran to Armenia to Turkey with the Hittites. So it's pretty much the same geographical area. And then you have right here in orange, Urartu, and you have right here in green, Mitanni. So keep all that in mind. So here's another paper dealing with genetic relatedness to Kurds and other Middle Eastern populations, and dealing with the Kurds' ancestors. This paper is called Genetic HLA Study of Kurds in Iraq, Iran, and Tbilisi, excuse me for my pronunciation, Caucasus, Georgia, relatedness and medical implications. So it reads, Kurds from Iraq, Duhok, and Erbil area of North Iraq have been analyzed for HLA genes. Their HLA genetic profile has been compared with that of other Kurd groups from Iran and Georgia Caucasus. That word is basically referring to the Georgia Caucasus. And also worldwide populations. Our HLA study conclusions are that Kurds most probably belong to an ancient Mediterranean/Middle East/Caucasian genetic substratum, and that present results and those previously obtained by us and Kurds may be useful for medicine in future Kurd transplantation programs. it is discussed that one of the most ancient Kurd ancestor groups is in Hurrians, 2000 years ago, or 2000 BC. And so, again, another paper connecting the ancestors of the Kurds, a non-Semitic people, to the Hurrians, and another non-Semitic people. So, continuing, it reads, on the other hand, Kurd people live in different countries in the Middle East, such as Syria, Armenia, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran, and the so-called Kurdistan, land of the Kurds. Kurdistan is a region placed South Caucasus and north of ancient Mesopotamia. According to genetic studies, in Turkish and Kurdish populations, you notice how they use the term Turkish and not Turkic. In Turkish and Kurdish populations, a Anatolian Mediterranean source for both populations was put forth. It may be possible that Kurds are initially coming from ancient Hurrians. So that right there, very powerful information connecting Turkish people and Kurdish people, Turkish populations and Kurdish populations to the ancient Hurrians. So here again is a map of Kurdistan. Here's a bit closer map actually of Kurdistan. It stretches from Iran all the way to Turkey and up into the South Caucasus, and pretty much is the exact same geographical location of the Hurrians. But anyways, continuing with the study, it reads, the second cluster comprises Europeans, Mediterraneans, Caucasus, and Iranian populations. Iraqi Kurds, Iran Kurds, and Georgia Kurds are located relatively close together. So keeping all this in mind, basically Europeans, Mediterraneans, Caucasians, Iranians, they're all genetically close. And this also includes the Kurds of Iraq, Iran, and Georgia, all of being non-Semitic populations, non-Semitic people. So here is a chart from the study dealing with that, and it has Iraq Kurds and Georgia Kurds. They're very, very close. It has Armenians right here. It has Iran Kurds. It has Cretans, who are Greek people, Georgians, Macedonians, and other Mediterranean and Near Eastern people towards the north. So this reads, plain genetic distance DA show that Iraq Kurds' closest genetic distance are the following: Near East populations, Iran Kurds, Palestinians, Far Parsi, Georgia Kurds, and Ashkenazi Jews. Eastern Mediterranean populations, Armenians, Cretans, and Macedonians. And Mediterranean populations, Sardinians, Spaniards, Algerians, and Italians. And most of those populations that the Kurds are related to and are basically non-Semitic populations, most of those populations are European or Caucasian. That Kurds are, as they say, closest genetic distance to, with a few exceptions. So here is a chart showing just another chart showing the close relatedness. Here are the Iran Kurds, the Iraq Kurds, and the Georgia Kurds. Here are all the people that they're very close to genetically. You have your Italians and your Armenians and Cretans and Balach, and etc., etc. Y'all can see the rest. But so continuing with the study, it reads, our conclusions were that Their HLA profile showed that Kurds form part of Mediterranean stock of people and also had Caucasus genetic traits, Slavan Georgians. Also, it is worth mentioning that Lak population, East Caucasus area, may be close to both Lur and Kurd populations, and Lak name could be could be considered purpose of Lur and Kurd words. In the present paper, we have analyzed HLA genes in Kurds living in North Iraq, Erbil and Dohuk areas. Comparison with other populations place them as a Middle Eastern population, close to Kurds from Tbilisi, Georgia, Palestinians, Armenians, and Kurds from Iran. In both analyses, Kurds are also close to Caucasian, Slavic, Georgian populations. Conclusion is that Kurds are genetically close to surrounding Caucasian and Mediterranean populations and that have remained settled down in Kurdistan since ancient times. Supporting historical evidence is viewed in our previous work. And I would agree. If Kurds are descendants of Iranian slash Hurrian peoples, then all this kind of makes sense. And continuing, it says HLA genetic similarity have been reported between Turks whose genes belong to old Anatolian stock, likely the Hittites, and Kurds. Kurds and Turks speak languages that are included in different families. However, Kurd HLA genetic studies include them into Mediterranean stock, together with Turks. Other genetic studies based on Y chromosome in Kurds in Turkey, Georgia, and Iran identify a dominant presence of haplogroups originated in Middle East, Anatolia, or Mesopotamia, and show a strong association with Jews, Lebanese, and Turkish genes. Also, Iranian populations are close to Kurds, and that makes sense as well. Thus, Middle East populations from Mediterranean border and Kurds seem originally to belong to a similar ethnic group according to HLA autosomic and Y chromosome genes results. Kurds have always lived in the mountains, being autochthonous 6000 BC. Hurrians, whose language was Caucasian and not Indo-European, may be Kurds' ancient genetic background. Review these references. By 1200 BC, Medes and others invaded Hurrian area. In summary, all three Kurd populations studied in the present paper are genetically close together and to other Mediterranean and Caucasus populations according to HLA genes. And so again, here is Kurdistan, and here is the Hurrian kingdom. And here's another paper dealing with HLA genes, dealing with Kurds. And the paper is called Population Genetic Relationships Between Mediterranean Populations Determined by HLA Allele Distribution and a Historic Perspective. And it reads, Kurds and Armenians are genetically very close to Turks and other Middle Eastern populations. And again, Kurds, Armenians, Turks, non-Semitic people, anciently descending from non-Semitic populations from the ancient Near East, whether it's Hittites, Mitanni, Kassites, etc. And basically, if you have the same type of genome of these Kurds, Armenians, and Turks, this genome would not be the Semitic genome in origin. These would be, I would still say Middle Eastern, but this would be the more Indo-European branch or the Iranian Caucasian branch of Middle Easterners. I wouldn't consider that to be Semitic because they're literally not Semitic speakers, both ancient times and even modern times. And here is Kurdistan, stretching from Iran to Turkey. And here is the Hurrians, stretching from Iran to Turkey and the Caucasus. So genetically, the Kurdish are another ethnic group that likely descends from the Hurrians. Ethnic groups like Kurds and Armenians seem to be a mix of Caucasian Hurrians and Iranian Indo-Europeans. Other Near Eastern populations are genetically no different than Kurds, and this is extremely important to note, and also is fascinating, because Kurds are a non-Semitic people, yet many Middle Eastern populations line right up with them. Furthermore, genetically speaking, Kurds are basically Caucasian and Iranian based on their DNA. You can literally see this in DNA tests. So let's actually look at some Kurdish DNA tests. So again, all you got to do is type in Kurdish DNA test results, and you're going to find all this. So this is from Quora, dealing with Kurdish DNA tests. West Asian, wouldn't deny it. They are definitely West Asian, but what is their population? Here is Turkey and Iran, 98.2%. This is from Reddit. You can go to Reddit, look up Kurdish or Kurd DNA test results. West Asian, 99%. Wouldn't disagree. These are a Middle Eastern people. But what is their specific ancestry? Iranian and Caucasian, and those are not Semitic people. But I think most of y'all know that Kurds aren't Semitic speakers. They're definitely known to be an Iranian people. But here's more DNA tests. Kurdish DNA results. West Asian, 96%. What is most of that West Asian? Iranian and Caucasian at 78%. Here's another test down here. Kurdistan, West Asian, 99%. It's a lot. Iraq and Turkey, 99.8%. Here is from Ancestry. We just looked at 23andMe, and here's Ancestry. So dealing with Kurdish ancestry, basically split between Iran/Persia to Turkey and the Caucasus. Iran/Persia and Turkey and the Caucasus. This is all from 23. This is from Ancestry. And again, Iran/Persia, Turkey and the Caucasus. It has Armenians, which makes sense. And this is another one, Kurdistan, Reddit. Iran, Persia, Turkey, and Caucasus. That's literally what the genetic profile of a Kurdish person is. It's a split between Caucasians and Iranians, non-Semitic populations. So Kurds are genetically Caucasian and Iranian, which fits with the understanding of Kurds being a mix of Hurrian Caucasians and Iranian Indo-Europeans. We can even look at Kurdish raw DNA data from GEDmatch and see that they are basically Caucasian and Iranian as well. Kurds are genetically close to Iranian and Caucasian populations. So this, again, is from Reddit. Just look it up. Dealing with the DNA from 23andMe, but then this person put their DNA into GEDmatch, and also another DNA company right here. And this is the breakdown. So from 23andMe, West Asian DNA, 99.6%, to be expected. Most of the DNA is Iranian and Caucasian, 76.2%. So breaking it down into GEDmatch, the results are Kurd, very close. Chechnyan, we talked about the Chechnyans. They're very close to the Chechnyans at 3%. Iranian, that's also in the 3s. And so I'm going to just stop right there. But Kurd, Chechnyan, Iranian is basically the groups we've been talking about. And they put their DNA into this test as well. I'm not for sure which company this is. I think this is Living DNA, but basically you see that they have Kurdish at 85.2%. Then you have South Caucasus at 7.5%. But anyways, going to admixture results and to single population, what you see in the top two is Kurdish and Iranian, and that makes a lot of sense. And here's another DNA test, but these are two different DNA tests. And when I saw it, I was like, oh, that's fascinating, fascinating. So here are the results of a Georgian person. As we know, the Georgians are a Caucasian people, and here's a Kurd from Turkey. So when you look at their results, they're pretty similar. Caucasian, 63%. And for the Kurdish, for this Georgian person, Caucasian is 63%. For this Kurdish person, Caucasian is 41%. And they both get a Baloch as well. The Kurdish actually has a little bit more Baloch. And they also get, Mediterranean and Southwest Asian, and, etc., etc. And you see right here, this was both from Harpa, by the way, as you can see down here, Harpa World from JetMatch. And Georgian and Kurd, it's very close. Here is yet another DNA test. This is from a Kurdish person. This is from a Georgian person. And I'm just showing you how this Kurdish people, an Iranian-speaking people, and this Georgian person, a Caucasian-speaking people, genetically are the exact same people. So here it's population with this Kurd and this Georgian, and it is at 42% for the Kurdish person, 57% for the Georgian person, very similar. And then what's next? Mediterranean. 26 for the Kurdish person, 29 for the Georgian person, and then Southwest Asian. Southwest Asian is next, 10% for the Kurdish person, 5% for the Georgian person. But we'll stop right there because you get the point. But now we're going to go to single population dealing with JetMatch, and it's Kurdish, Azerbaijani, Turk, and we mentioned from the study, it talked about them being closer to Turks. Turk, Istanbul, Iranian, Armenian, and we'll stop right there. I just go ahead and go to the next one. And Assyrian, we talked about the Assyrians, some of them possibly descending from Hurrians, but we'll stop at least right there. So for this Georgian person, single population, Azerbaijani, or I might not be Azerbaijani, excuse me, but this is an area in the Caucasus. I forgot the name at the moment. I believe it's as Kazakhstan. Excuse me. But number 2 is Georgian, and of course that makes sense. This person is Georgian. Then Armenian, then Turk, then Azerbaijani, then Kurdish. So as we see, the top 7 to 6 results are pretty much the same for this Georgian person as it is for this Kurdish person. So Georgians and, Caucasians and Kurds are kind of similar. Here's a Kurd from Turkey and from Georgia, and again, it's basically the same thing. Dealing with single population, you see Kurdish, Iranian, Azerbaijani. You see Azerbaijani, Kurdish, and Iranian, or not Azerbaijani, but you see Kurdish, Iranian, and Azerbaijani right here. And you see, Armenian, Dagestan. That's interesting. Dagestan, talked about them. So all these Caucasian and Iranian populations is in the genetic makeup, in the deep ancestry of the Kurds and the Georgians. So it's very interesting when you see the genetic papers that deal with these people, and then you look at their individual DNA tests, and it does line up. Like, I think that's it's kind of fascinating to me. I'm just going to show you a few more. Here's Kurdish results. Here is Georgian results. So population, Caucasus, 39%. Caucasus for this Georgian, 61%. Let's skip down to single population. So Kurds, Iranian, single population over here. Armenians, Georgians, etc. So pretty much the same genetically to a certain extent. Here's a Kurd from Turkey. I did not write this, by the way. But anyways, what you see for single population, because I got all this from looking at different DNA tests on different websites. But anyways, the single population, Kurdish, Iranian, Armenian for this Kurd. Georgian person, you see Georgian and various Caucasian populations. You see our Armenian right here, Iranian, Chechenian. So all of this is pretty much the same genetically, kind of like what the paper said. So let's look at the autosomal breakdown a little bit more, dealing with Dodecad K12B, dealing with Kurdish autosomal DNA. And so when you look at it, Caucasus, we're going to deal with Caucasus specifically, how much Caucasian DNA that Kurds have. And their Caucasus DNA is 43% for this individual, 43.79% for this individual, 43.67% for this Kurdish person, 43.35% for this Kurdish person, 42.57% Caucasian for this Kurdish person, 42.08% for this Kurdish individual, 42.04% for this Kurdish person having Caucasian DNA. So even looking at deep ancestry of Kurds, they are basically genetically Caucasian and Iranian people. And one of the paternal haplogroups among the Kurds is haplogroup J. Now they have a lot of others, but haplogroup J is seen at a very good percentage in them. So here is the Kurdish Y DNA, and you see J2 at 21.6% and J1 at 11%. So basically J would be at 35.4%. So most of them would kind of have the J marker more than any other marker, and even says that main Y chromosome haplogroups in Kurds are J, R, and E. And also find it a little bit interesting that they have E among them. But J is definitely the highest among the Kurds, which is, of course, very intriguing. And here is the sources from which this is coming from, the Y DNA. So here's all the J. They basically have J in general, but they also have J1. And here are the various subclades of J1, such as J1-M267. They have J1B1B2B, J1B2B-P58. They also have J2, J2-M172. They have J2A1 and various other branches of J. So here's just a map, and here's all the sources, by the way, for how this map was developed. And here's the J1 in Kurdistan, ranging from 10 to 40%. Here's the J2 in Kurdistan, among the Kurdish people, from 10 to 40%. So it's quite a good percentage, I would say. Here's a closer image of Kurdistan with J1, and then Kurdistan with J2. And here is a map of Kurdistan. And here's a map of the Hurrians. So haplogroup J is decently among the Kurdish people. It's represented extremely high and about all of their peoples and populations. And they have around 10 to 40% for both J1 and J2. So if technically you were to put J1 and J2 together, they would have, technically around 80%. And interestingly enough, Kurdistan overlaps with the ancient territory of the Hurrians. But also keep in mind that when it comes to the Hurrians, they likely had haplogroup J. I'm going to read only what's in yellow from this paper, How Eurasia Was Born, and it reads, the Northeast Caucasian language family seems to show clear links to ancient Eastern Anatolia, as most subclades of J1-Z1842 can be linked to the Armenian highlands in present-day Azerbaijan, precisely fitting the exact location of the Kura-Araxes culture. 3 subclades of it, J1-ZS3042, J1-ZS5658, J1-ZS2872, and J1-Z5353 are widespread among Northeast Caucasian groups, suggests Northeast Caucasian languages to have originated from the Coraxus culture, as ancient J1 subclades also seem to have been present in the ancient Levant as well. This supports the existence of the Alduin language family, linking Hurrian to Northeast Caucasian. So, with all that being said, let's kind of get to the last point, which I think is equally as interesting as everything we covered, which is, what do Kurds look like? What is the phenotype of a Kurdish person? So here is a Kurdish man and a Kurdish girl, and I would say from their phenotype, they have what most people will call the standard Middle Eastern phenotype, i.e. tanned-ish skin, or what some people might try to say olive skin, but I kind of disagree with that term. But I would say tanned-ish skin, dark hair, and a long or a hooked or aquiline nose. There's more Kurdish people. And remember, these people are a non-Semitic, but a Iranian-speaking people. Here are Kurdish soldiers, and again, I would say tanned skin with aquiline nose, or hook nose is what aquiline means, and dark hair, as well as dark eyes. Here are more Kurdish men, and again, this is what people typically call the Middle Eastern phenotype, and I would agree that this is a Middle Eastern phenotype. But I would disagree if people were to say this is a Semitic phenotype, because Kurdish people are not Semitic, yet they have this standard phenotype. And again, a Kurdish man, slightly tanned, dark hair, dark eyes, aquiline nose. Some people even call it the Roman nose. There's more Kurdish people, Kurdish girls with the Kurdish flag, Kurdish soldiers that look Middle Eastern, I would say is Middle Eastern, but a branch of Middle Eastern people who are Iranian speakers, who are genetically Caucasian and Iranian. There are more Kurdish female soldiers. Some people will ignorantly say that this is an Arab phenotype. This is not an Arab phenotype. This is just simply Kurdish people. And here are more Kurdish women, having various skin tones from light tan to sort of darkish tan, dark-haired, dark-eyed, aquiline-nosed. And here is a Kurdish man, Kurdish woman, or women. And you can see dark black hair, skin not too light. They're not like a German, but not too dark, not like an African. But they are, I will say this, because this is one thing people tend to say a lot about Middle Easterners, they're not white like Germans and they're not black like Africans, but when dealing with specifically the Kurdish people, although they're not German and although they're not Nigerian, they're still technically a branch of Indo-European peoples. All Indo-European peoples don't have to look blue-eyed, blonde-haired like a German. There are Indo-European peoples that can look like this, like Kurdish people. And here are more Kurdish people, Kurdish men, Kurdish women. There's an older Kurdish man and some other Kurdish men. These Kurdish men right here actually, to a certain extent, to me, again, my opinion, to me, look like Iranians. Look like a typical Iranians. But that would make sense since technically, genetically speaking, and even linguistically speaking, they are kind of Iranian. So phenotypically, the Kurds kind of look Armenoid, I would say. Basically white to tan skin, straight black to brunette hair and a hooked or aquiline nose. They actually look typically like a Middle Easterner, even though Kurds aren't Semitic, keep that in mind. But their phenotype is something most people would associate or call Semitic, and that will be inaccurate, even though genetically they are a Caucasian Iranian people. Here's Armenoid, just to reintroduce it. Short-headed and long-skulled type with fleshy features, a flat occiput and hooked nose, often black-haired and light brown skin, common in the mountain ranges of Asia Minor, especially Anatolia, Armenia and Anatolia. And it's found in ancient Sumerians, who are a non-Semitic people, found in Babylonians, who remember the Kassite Babylonians that ruled Babylon for 500 years, and they were an Iranian and Hurrian people, the Hittites and Anatolian people, and the Cretans, and those are just Greek people from the islands of Crete, or from the island of Crete. So, and here's an Armenid, widespread type found in its most specialized form in the mountains of Asia Minor, associated with the ancient Cretans, Europeans, and the Hittite kingdom, Europeans, common in Armenians, Turks of the mountain ranges, and then it goes into other peoples and places. And physical traits: light brown skin, wavy black brown hair, hyper-boralicocephalic. Here's the Indo-Iraniid, a relatively recent contact type with a position intermediate between Indo-Balachid and Iraniid, widespread in Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan, reaching to northern India and to the east, and Turkey in the west. So, and a lot of the Kurdish photos we looked at kind of did look like a split between an Indo-Iraniid and a Armeniid, I would say. Physical traits is light to medium brown skin, straight or wavy, brown-black, plentiful hair. So Kurds are a very important Near Eastern population to study and know about because many Middle Eastern populations are related to them. Yet the Kurds are a non-Semitic people, both ancient and modern. With that being said, why are Semitic speakers in the Middle East related to non-Semitic people? This is a question we have to ask ourselves, and this is a question that I'm going to answer. What is the genome of Middle Easterners? But this is where we'll end. The Hurrians and the Kurds. And this is where we end Haplogroup J equals Japheth part 5. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, click the bell, and share the video. Leave a comment for any questions you might have, and follow my social media accounts that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. And with all of that out of the way, have a great day, and shalom.